Thank you, Ayesha, for joining me. I'm now recording. I just wanted to know sort of quickly how COVID is affecting the organizations and people that you work with at Remake.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me here, Val. I think these conversations in the context of the pandemic are so important. One of the things that we at Remake did was immediately contact frontline labor organizer groups as well as a network of supplier partners. And what we heard starting early March was that as retail had started to contract, as a lot of orders had started to dry up, brands were en masse canceling orders. And I think for people listening in, it's important to understand that the industry operates on debt, and a lot of that risk is pushed on to suppliers, which in turn is then borne by the makers of our clothes. And so as brands weren't really having sales and retail stores were shuttered, they were essentially pushing that risk back to suppliers. And what suppliers were telling us was, even for material that they had already paid for, even for labor costs that they had incurred, where product was sitting in factories or in warehouses, they were still waiting for those payments. And so we launched a Pay Up campaign, which it's been so heartening to see it become a global movement. We've been working with many wonderful advocacy organizations in the UK, in the US, and to date we've managed to get 13 brands to pay up. But of course, the work continues because there's plenty of other brands where it's a lot of PR spinning. And, the truth is there are no orders in the summer. In the fall, we will see a beating when it comes to sales. And so it's going to be really important to get money in the hands of government makers, because people are insecure from a food standpoint, from a safety standpoint right now.
Yeah. The stories coming out of some of, Bangladesh are just appalling, really.
Look, they can't socially distance, right? There are so many people just, the factories weren't giving them the right information. So we've got organizers telling us they were walking, several miles to try and come back every week to be paid for work that had been done the month before. And, what's to happen as everyone starts to get sick? They don't have access to hospitals. They're living paycheck to paycheck. They don't have gear. In Pakistan, we've heard that some of the factories have now deemed themselves essential work and have opened up. And so, it's about this economic survival and pitting it artificially against the health and safety of people.
Yeah. So the challenge of this time is to look at the immediate needs, but also to look at the future, because several key figures in this area have talked about the fact that there may be more pandemics, almost certainly, and that we are, for some of these countries, looking very immediately at ecological breakdown due to the climate emergency. So how do you prepare for those in a time when you're also trying to deal with the immediate concerns of people who literally have no food?
Yeah. I think, look, this is going to be a very long battle, right? So at a very immediate level, we have a very short window of time as factories are starting to shutter, as brands and retailers, some of them will file for bankruptcy, to get money in the hands of workers now. So whether it's multilateral institutions working on this, whether it's government stimulus package and relief funds, whether it's chasing the brands to pay up, all of that work matters now, because to your point, when we're in the context of Cambodia, Pakistan, India, these are countries without the safety nets. We don't have a healthcare infrastructure for sick workers as the pandemic starts to spread. And so that urgent relief is really important. But I do look at this as a reset in terms of, okay, what has COVID-19 taught us? We know that this pandemic in itself, will open up and then there will be waves of this. There are too many people on the planet, so this won't be our first and last pandemic. And what does this mean from a supply chain resiliency standpoint? And so I think, historically, we've often talked about these issues from a sustainability standpoint, but here this is really, it's the secret's out on how fragile supply chains are. The first wave of this we saw when China was shut down for 2 months and essentially had fabric shortages. And then with the domino effect of Western brands starting to see sales contracting, that you've seen the impacts not just at the cut and sew factories, but all the way up to the farmers. And so my hope is, first and foremost, that when we think about supply chain resilience from a climate standpoint, from future-proofing for pandemics, that brands are really taking a hard look at their at their supply chains and
Yeah.
thinking how you build that in.
Yeah.
I think practically what that means for some of the smaller sustainable brands that we work with that have our seal of approval, that tend to work with closer manufacturing, that tend to have, access to cotton and yarn supply right here in the US, that are thinking about shipment in a smaller, closer way. In some ways, if the business doesn't decimate because of COVID, my hope is that they'll really rise like Phoenix from the ashes.
Yes.
Right, because they have the supplier partner relationships. They think of them as true partners. They've kept material and source closer to home. And
Yes.
for some of the bigger fast fashion brands who've, essentially gone off to Ethiopia and some of the world's poorest places just because of how low wages are, I really hope that this is an awakening, that in building this product for rapid obsolescence, that's anyway going to fall apart and be in landfills, that, the cobbling together of this supply chain has now been decimated. And so does that mean that some of these brands won't make it? And I sure hope not,
Yeah.
So that's, I think, one thing. I think the other thing that this has really unmasked is financing, and looking at the way that this industry essentially operates on debt, right? It's unheard of to think about for 30, 60 to 90 days, most suppliers are not paid for labor cost as well as material cost till product is shipped. Also, the industry doesn't really work with any letters of credit. There's no banks backing this, right? It's purchase orders. There's the contracts are very ironclad in terms of what the brands and retailers demand from the factories, from a quality standpoint, from a copyright standpoint. But in terms of payment, what we've seen is, well, there's absolutely nothing. And so I really hope that when we're thinking about finance terms, how much should brands and retailers be putting down? When they evoke force majeure contracts, should there be insurance in place? Why should the suppliers and in turn the most vulnerable makers of our clothes bear all the risk?
Yes, absolutely. What you said about the sort of smaller sustainable labels is one of the most hopeful things I've heard about this, that some of the labels that are really trying to do the best they can right now may be the ones that rise out of the fire. But the flip side, obviously, is that the fast fashion industry employs so many people. And so sometimes when we talk about we have to reduce the amount of clothing that we're making. It's not sustainable. But what happens to the people who are making that clothing in those countries? How do we manage a just transition? So even though they're making fewer clothes, they're still getting enough to live on and thrive and protect themselves against the climate emergency that's coming.
Look, this is, I think, in some ways how the fast fashion brands have pitted us against each other to say that the environmental conversation is in conflict with the labor conversation. When I think of sustainability, it's one and the same, right? I'm from Pakistan, like my part of the world, in Bangladesh. It's the same frontline communities that are going to be most impacted by climate change, that are dealing with the air pollution, the impacts of natural resource depletion far more. And, the fast fashion industry hasn't really had a history of lifting this generation of women out of poverty. Whenever wages have become slightly expensive, they've moved, first when the multi-tribe arrangement expired and everyone was in China, India, Pakistan, then off they went to Cambodia. And the minute even in Bangladesh wages went up slightly, you started to see an uptick in Myanmar and Ethiopia. And so really what I think we need here is to be thinking about governments, thinking about what sort of labor protections, this is a time for a reset that they should be pushing for. What sort of environmental protections, knowing that their countries aren't going to be able to deal with the plunder of their resources in this way. The other thing is with automation coming, a lot of workers now it's coming closer to home and faster with the pandemic. We're going to have to be thinking about moving a bulk of this workforce in any case. And if anything COVID-19 has taught us is, the brands have turned their back. Gap still hasn't paid, CNA hasn't paid, Primark is saying they'll pay, but how quickly, we don't know. And so it's to say that, it's not as if these fast fashion brands have a history of taking care of the people that make their clothes. So why should we think they do it now in a pandemic or post-pandemic?
Yeah, excellent. One of the other things that we sometimes talk about is the purpose of fashion in a world that is in an emergency. And that also sort of slightly links to what we would like to see the purpose of fashion being, so that it's not just sort of tied to superficial trends, and that it could be something much more. What do you think would be the role of clothing in a world where we do have to look at humanitarian and ecological issues?
I think really this is about, we have a slogan here at Remake about wearing your values, and what do your clothes say about you? And, I often tell people this: you buy something for $5 or $10, that price reflects the exploitation of women and our ecological resources. And I think in this pandemic, one of the things that we've really seen is a solidarity for essential workers, is to understand how important the human beings that are picking our food and making our clothes and delivering our mail and taking care of us when we get sick in hospitals is. And so my hope is that as people are sitting at home and thinking about, I don't have very much money to buy, and non-essential spending has to go away because times are going to get tougher, we're headed into a recession, that this bags and bags of clothes that we've historically bought that we then throw away doesn't have that meaning, that we don't want clothes built for rapid obsolescence. What we're wanting instead is experiential ways to support brands that help us speak about our value system, that are essentially connecting us to a community of like-minded tribe of people that believe in women's empowerment, of equal pay for equal work, that are putting climate justice in the forefront. I'm particularly hopeful, a lot of our community are Gen Z and millennials, and a lot of them have been talking about being isolated and depressed at home. This is a generation that has grown up with so much economic shock, college debt, and what they're seeking right now, more than anything, is community. And so I really do think that fashion can play a role in that. It can a great community and sort of communicating to the world in its artistic expression of who I am. And I hope who I am means I'm a warrior for women and climate.
Yes, that's wonderful. It's one of the things I do love about Remake is the sort of the balance of telling the real stories behind the garments that we see on the street, and addressing the Gen Z consumer who have so much at stake in this new world. What you've just described there, I would say, is pretty much your Dreamscape fashion industry, wouldn't it? What could we do?
And in the dream state, I would add, consumers are buying fewer, better things. They're wearing their values. Their closet means something to them beyond just cheap clothes. Warehouse workers are unionized, as we've seen with Amazon workers and such getting sick. There are more cooperative versions of factories that are worker owned. We've seen some of those models in the UK and the US. So it's like workers have ownership as part of the factories, and that sustainable brands who have these connections and relationships from factory to warehouse to end customer are the ones that are really thriving. That's the dream state. The dark state, right? It's to say, look, China has really exerted its dominance in the market right now, and the way that they're expanding, not just in South Asia but in Africa. As people will be hurting financially, as soon as things open up, will they just go back to more cheap fashion because that's all they can afford? And we won't learn anything from this moment and just go back to cobbling these terrible supply chains, and that's the nightmare that we all live with.
That truly is the nightmare that you described there. It's the thing we fear most, that everyone will try and claw their way back to the normality that's taken us into this position in the first place. What can we do, sort of as the shoppers, the consumers, the people who consume fashion? What can we do to help the communities that you work with?
So, I really appreciate this question. I think at an urgent level, anyone who's able to give on our website, remake.world, we have, direct ways of giving to frontline workers. So that's like the Garment Worker Center in LA. They've historically been an advocacy-based organization, but overnight they had to become a direct relief organization. They're literally going door to door to deliver groceries to garment makers. Similarly, there's BCWS and Awaj in Bangladesh. So there's these organizations that are filling the gaps because government and brands and factories aren't doing it. So, if you have in your heart are able to give, please do that. But
Yeah.
I also know that times are hard, and not everyone, whether it's $1, $5, even that may be very difficult. And so the other thing that I think I want people to draw hope from is the power of your voice. Time to flex those advocacy muscles. We launched a change.org petition to get demand brands to pay up. I can send you a link, Belle, so you can include it in the conversation. In less than 3 weeks, we have over 10,000 people who signed it. The important thing about that petition is it's going directly to the executives of brands. We've on the back end had conversations with brands who've written us back because, especially now with stores shuttered, your online reputation is everything. And so, tag some of your favorite brands. Topshop is not paying up, the Cardia Group, Walmart, CNA, Gap, and ask them, this is not the time to turn your back on the makers of our clothes. So, donate, keep up with the stories, sign the petition, follow us on Remake Our World. These are all the ways to be a part of a movement and make sure that we're rebuilding this fashion industry into a force for good.
Thank you so much, Ayesha. We'll wrap up. Thank you for your work as well.
Thank you.
Yes. I don't know how long Remake's been around, sorry.
So no, I think we're better known in the American context than the UK context. We've only been around for 4 years. I myself have been doing this work for some 15 years. I used to be part of the Better Work team, so part of the ILO. And honestly, Belle, that was eye-opening, just to be in factories in Cambodia and Jordan. And, I was the brand officer, so essentially getting companies to sign up to the core principles and then say, you constantly have forced labor, all your factories are in overtime. And the truth is we just haven't seen the improvements. They just flee from country to country. I was really upset with even the H&M being the most transparent brand sort of publication out with the,
Fashion Revolution.
It's just the wrong time to be talking about policies. We should be talking about what's happening in the countries, workers are not being paid, and even if H&M pays for the back orders, it's not doing any great favor. It's still shitty product that's going to fall apart, that, keeps these women, and we don't even talk about the health impacts, carpal tunnel. Like, if you are sewing for 10, 11, 12 hours on a factory line, just the ergonomic implications of that are terrible, not to mention sexual harassment and violence. I mean, the truth is these are not good jobs. I really do hope that with automation coming, and we didn't really get into, the whole R&D and technology conversation, we're going to lose some of these workers. The dexterity of your fingers are needed for making jeans and t-shirts.